Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Jekyll and Hyde. This is the last video, the last video of reading. There will be another playlist of videos that takes you through theme and character in a lot more detail later on, so do stay tuned for that. But in this video, we will be reading the final part of the last chapter, Henry Jekyll's full statement of the case. If you haven't already listened and read along to parts 1 and 2, please pause me, go and check it out in the playlist. It's a very long chapter, which is why I've split it into 3, just to make it a little bit more easily digestible for you. As always, I will read through, I'll pause here and there just to make sure that everyone is happy with what is going on. But for the final time, let's get started. There comes an end to all things. The most capacious measure is filled at last, and this brief condescension to my evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul. And yet I was not alarmed. The fall seemed natural, like a return to the old days before I had made my discovery. It was a fine, clear January day, wet underfoot where the frost had melted, but cloudless overhead, and the Regent's Park was full of winter chirrupings and sweet with spring odour. I sat in the sun on a bench, the animal within me licking the chops of memory, the spiritual side a little drowsed, promising subsequent penitence, but not yet moved to begin. So he sat there kind of like thinking bad thoughts and going, oh, I'll say sorry later. So like that little part of him that feels guilty, he's like, it'll sort it out later. For now, let's just sort of have some naughty thoughts or whatever it is he's thinking about. After all, I reflected, I was like my neighbours, and then I smiled, comparing myself with other men, comparing my active goodwill with the lazy cruelty of their neglect. And at the very moment of that vainglorious thought, a qualm came over me, a horrid nausea and the most deadly shuddering. These passed away and left me faint, and then, as in its turn, the faintness subsided, I began to be aware of a change in the temper of my thoughts. A greater boldness, a contempt of danger, a solution of the bonds of obligation. I looked down, my clothes hung formlessly on my shrunken limbs. The hand that lay on my knee was corded and hairy. I was once more Edward Hyde. A moment before, I had been safe of all men's respect, wealthy, beloved, the cloth laying for me in the dining room at home. And now I was the common quarry of mankind. Hunted, houseless, a known murderer, thrall to the gallows. So let's just double check that you understand why he's transformed. He was basically sat in the park, sort of enjoying, I don't know, maybe remembering being Edward Hyde, or just certainly having some thoughts that were not particularly moral. And then he had this little moment of arrogance where he was like, I'm just the same as everyone else. And then thought, except that I'm so much better because I can do this and I can do that. And that moment, that little nasty, snidey thought, it was like the balance shifted in him, and that kind of darkness propelled Edward Hyde forward, and suddenly he's changed into him. But he's in the middle of Regent's Park, so he's in trouble. My reason wavered, but it did not fail me utterly. I have more than once observed that in my second character, my faculties seemed sharpened to a point, and my spirits more tensely elastic. Thus it came about that where Jekyll perhaps might have succumbed, Hyde rose to the importance of the moment. My drugs were in one of the presses of my cabinet. How was I to reach them? That was the problem that, crushing my temples in my hands, I set myself to solve. The laboratory door I had closed. If I sought to enter by the house, my own servants would consign me to the gallows. I saw I must employ another hand, and thought of Lanyon. How was he to be reached? How persuaded? Supposing that I escaped capture in the streets, how was I to make my way into his presence? And how should I, an unknown and displeasing visitor, prevail on the famous physician to rifle the studies of his colleague Dr. Jekyll? Then I remembered that of my original character, one part remained to me. I could write my own hand. And once I had conceived that kindling spark, the way that I must follow became lighted up from end to end. Okay, so eagle-eyed readers, you should hopefully be thinking back to Dr. Lanyon's narrative and the remarkable incident of Dr. Lanyon. So now we understand that Jekyll did not write that letter. It was, of course, Mr. Hyde, which we kind of already knew, but it's just made perfectly clear here. Thereupon I arranged my clothes as best as I could, and summoning a passing hansom, drove to a hotel in Portland Street, the name of which I chanced to remember. At my appearance, which was indeed comical enough, however tragic a fate these garments covered, the driver could not conceal his mirth. I gnashed my teeth upon him with a gust of devilish fury, and the smile withered from his face, happily for him, yet more happily for myself, for in another instance I had certainly dragged him from his perch. At the inn as I entered, I looked about me with so black a countenance as made the attendants tremble. Not a look did they exchange in my presence, but obsequiously took my orders, led me to a private room, and brought me wherewithal to write. Hyde, in danger of his life, was a creature new to me, shaken with inordinate anger, strung to the pitch of murder, lusting to inflict pain. Yet the creature was astute, mastered his fury with a great effort of the will, composed his 2 important letters, one to Lanyon and one to Poole, and, that he might receive actual evidence of their being posted, sent them out with directions that they should be registered. So Hyde is, he's a mix of 2 halves. He's irrational and full of rage. Like, he almost killed the guy driving his hansom cab because he laughed about his clothing. I mean, he's really animalistic. He gnashes his teeth at him and the driver's like, ugh. But then once he actually gets inside, he manages to sort of pull himself together, and he's like, no, write your letters, get it sorted. When Jekyll's kind of telling the story of that, he almost sounds, I don't know, impressed by him. Whatever you think. Thenceforward, he sat all day over the fire in the private room, gnawing his nails. There he dined, sitting alone with his fears, the waiter visibly quailing before his eye. And thence, when the night was fully come, he set forth in the corner of a closed cab, and was driven to and fro about the city streets of the city. I cannot say I. That child of hell had nothing human. Nothing lived in him but fear and hatred. And when at last, thinking the driver had begun to grow suspicious, he discharged the cab and ventured on foot, attired in his misfitting clothes, an object marked out for observation, into the midst of nocturnal passengers, these 2 base passions raged within him like a tempest. He walked fast, hunted by his fears, chattering to himself, skulking through the less frequented thoroughfares, counting the minutes that still divided him from midnight. Once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights. He smote her in the face, and she fled. Literally, would you like a match, sir? And off he goes. When I came to myself at Lanyon's, the horror of my old friend perhaps affected me somewhat. I do not know. It was at least but a drop in the sea to the abhorrence with which I looked back upon these hours. A change had come over me. It was no longer the fear of the gallows. It was the horror of being Hyde that racked me. I received Lanyon's condemnation partly in a dream. It was partly in a dream that I came home to my own house and got into bed. I slept after the prostration of the day, with a stringent and profound slumber which not even the nightmares that wrung me could avail to break. I woke in the morning shaken, weakened, but refreshed. I still hated and feared the thought of the brute that slept within me, and I had not, of course, forgotten the appalling dangers of the day before, but I was once more at home, in my own house and close to my drugs, and gratitude for my escape shone so strong in my soul that it almost rivalled the brightness of hope. I was stepping leisurely across the court after breakfast, drinking the chill of the air with pleasure, when I was seized again with those indescribable sensations that heralded the change, and I had but the time to gain the shelter of my cabinet before I was once again raging and freezing with the passion of Hyde. It took on this occasion a double dose to recall me to myself, and alas, 6 hours after, as I sat looking sadly in the fire, the pangs returned, and the drugs had to be re-administered. In short, from that day forth, it seemed only by a great effort, as of gymnastics, and only under the immediate stimulation of the drug, that I was able to wear the countenance of Jekyll. At all hours of the day and night, I would be taken with the premonitory shudder. Above all, if I slept or even dozed for a moment in my chair, it was always as Hyde that I awakened. Under the strain of this continually impending doom, and by the sleeplessness to which I now condemned myself, even before what I had thought possible to man, I became in my own person a creature eaten up and emptied by fever, languidly weak both in body and mind, and solely occupied by one thought, the horror of my other self. But when I slept, or when the virtue of the medicine wore off, I would leap almost without transition, for the pangs of transformation grew daily less marked, into the possession of a fancy brimming with images of terror, a soul boiling with causeless hatreds, and a body that seemed not strong enough to contain the raging energies of life. The powers of Hyde seemed to have grown with the sickliness of Jekyll, and certainly the hate that now divided them was equal on each side. So Jekyll has completely lost control. Like, he just, other than taking the potion, there is nothing that he can do. When I say taking the potion, I mean to turn back into Jekyll. He's turning into Hyde constantly, particularly when he falls asleep, which is quite interesting if you think about the idea of the subconscious and how that perhaps takes over when you are sleeping. So he's living this sort of tortured life. This explains why he had to become so secluded from his friends, because he has absolutely no control over these transformations. The powers of Hyde seem to have grown with the sickliness of Jekyll, and certainly the hate that now divided them was equal on each side. With Jekyll, it was a thing of vital instinct. He had now seen the full deformity of that creature that shared with him some of the phenomena of consciousness, and was co-heir with him to death. And beyond these links of community, which in themselves made the most poignant parts of his distress, he thought of Hyde, for all his energy of life, as of something not only hellish, but inorganic. This was the shocking thing, that the slime of the pit seemed to utter cries and voices, that the amorphous dust gesticulated and sinned, that what was dead and had no shape should usurp the offices of life. And this again, that insurgent horror was knit to him closer than a wife, closer than an eye, lay caged in his flesh, where he heard it mutter and felt it struggle to be born, and at every hour of weakness and in the confidence of slumber prevailed against him and deposed him out of life. The hatred of Hyde for Jekyll was of a different order. His terror of the gallows drove him continually to commit temporary suicide and return to his subordinate station of a part instead of a person. But he loathed the necessity. He loathed the despondency into which Jekyll was now fallen, and he resented the dislike with which he was himself regarded. Okay, so that makes sense as to why he keeps taking the potion to return to Jekyll. It's for fear of being caught. He knows that the longer he stays Hyde permanently in that situation, the more likely it is that he's going to get caught, but he resents it. Hence the ape-like tricks that he would play me, scrawling in my own hand blasphemies on the pages of my books, burning the letters and destroying the portrait of my father. And indeed, had it not been for his fear of death, he would long ago have ruined himself in order to involve me in the ruin. But his love of life is wonderful. I go further. I, who sicken and freeze at the mere thought of him, when I recall the objection and possession of this attachment, and when I know how he fears my power to cut him off by suicide, I find it in my heart to pity him. It is useless, and the time awfully fails me to prolong this description. No one has ever suffered such torments, let that suffice. And yet even to these, habit brought, no, not alleviation, but a certain callousness of soul, a certain acquiescence of despair, and my punishment might have gone on for years, but for the last calamity which has now fallen, and which has finally severed me from my own face and nature. My provision of the salt, which had never been renewed since the day of the first experiment, began to run low. I sent out for a fresh supply and mixed the draught. The ebullition followed, and the first change of colour, not the second. I drank it, and it was without efficiency. You will learn from Poole how I have had London ransacked. It was in vain, and I am now persuaded that my first supply was impure, and that it was that unknown impurity which lent efficacy to the draught. Okay, so now we understand the panic of those letters that we learned about in the last night, asking for, again, more and more and more of this drug and it never seeming to work. And the fact that he says at the very beginning of this chapter that his experiment actually failed, it's not just about the fact that he didn't distill himself perfectly. It was by chance. It was by chance. There was something wrong with one of these drugs and he wasn't actually able to create another replica of it with the pure version of the drugs. So it was all a mistake. About a week has passed and I am now finishing this statement under the influence of the last of the old powders. This then is the last time, short of a miracle, that Henry Jekyll can think his own thoughts or see his own face, now how sadly altered in this glass. Nor must I delay too long to bring my writing to an end, for if my narrative has hitherto escaped destruction, it has been by a combination of great prudence and of great good luck. Should the throes of change take me in the act of writing it, Hyde will tear it into pieces. But if some time shall have elapsed after I have laid it by, his wondrous selfishness and circumscription to the moment will probably save it once again from the action of his ape-like spite. And indeed, the doom that is closing on us both has already changed and crushed him. Half an hour from now, when I shall again and forever re-endue that hated personality, I know how I shall sit shuddering and weeping in my chair, or continue with the most strained and fear-struck ecstasy of listening to pace up and down this room, my last earthly refuge, and give ear to every sound of menace. Will Hyde die upon the scaffold? Or will he find the courage to release himself at the last moment? God knows. I am careless. This is my true hour of death, and what is to follow concerns another than myself. Here then, as I lay down the pen and proceed to seal up my confession, I bring the life of that unhappy Henry Jekyll to an end. That's it. We've done it. Hooray! Final thoughts. Like I said before, there are going to be some videos done for you on character and theme, chapter by chapter, that are going to go into this in much more analytical depth. But I can't leave the end of that book, without saying something about those final thoughts. Henry Jekyll has come to the point where he's completely and utterly lost control of Hyde. And when he writes his full statement of the case, it's because he's taken the last of this medicine, or this potion, I should say, that had the effect of the transformation. Nothing else was going to work. So we know from this moment that he's going to be Mr. Hyde. We also know, because of 2 chapters ago, that Mr. Hyde commits suicide, and that's how Utterson finds him. So everything is kind of wrapped up. But I'm interested in Henry Jekyll's last thoughts about Hyde, when he questions, will he die upon the scaffold, or will he find the courage to release himself at the last moment? And I wonder, what does he mean? Does he mean commit suicide? Is that what he means? To release himself from the horror of being hanged? Is that what he means? Or does he mean escape? Is he still, deep down, a little part of him, hoping that Edward Hyde carries on and continues to live the life that he has in front of him? I don't know, but either way, it does make me think that even at the end, Henry Jekyll is not fully remorseful, is still flawed enough to kind of root for Edward Hyde. You can disagree with me. Like I said earlier, it's for you to kind of decide, because it's debatable. That's one of the joys of English literature, is that you can see more than one interpretation, as long as there's evidence in the text. We're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for sticking through and reading this whole book with me bit by bit. Obviously, you can go back, reread anything that you didn't understand. Ask me any questions that you have about this chapter or any of them in the comments. And please do look out for future videos, because like I said, I will be making another playlist that will be much more detailed, focused on the chapters, with much more kind of analytical work focused on those exams. Again, there will also be lots of videos on other parts of your English literature and language studies, so please subscribe if you haven't already. But for the last time in the Miss Adams Teaches Jekyll and Hyde reading section, thank you so much for reading. Happy revising.